Hi everyone, my name is Emily Teacher, and today we're going to read Mount Vernon. No visit to Washington, D.C. is complete without a trip to Mount Vernon, the illustrious home of George Washington, our nation's first president. It is located just a few miles south of our nation's capital. Its expansive views, spacious lawns, shaded walks, and carefully manicured gardens make it one of the most popular tourist attractions in the nation. More than 1 million people annually visit Mount Vernon. There they may pay respects to the memory of our first president and his wife, the First Lady. Both are buried there. So we're talking about Mount Vernon, the very large and very impressive home of George Washington, who was the United States' first president. Let's learn more about this home, Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon had been in the Washington family for almost 100 years when George Washington inherited the property in 1761. It, com- it comprised 5 separate farms as well as the main residence overlooking the Potomac River, which he occupied with his wife and her 2 children from a former marriage. Because the house was too small for their needs, Washington added rooms and outbuildings. Some of this work was completed by the 317 enslaved people Washington kept at Mount Vernon. He also hired paid workers and supervised their work closely. By the time they had finished, Mount Vernon had been transformed into the fine mansion visitors see today. Washington was loath to leave his beautiful home. But his duty to his country required him to be absent from Mount Vernon from 1775 until 1783. So, because of his duty, his work, um, he was out from 1775 to 1783. So, for 8 years, Washington was not living in this home. During that time, he commanded the Continental Army in the war against the British. In his absence, a distant cousin, Lund Washington, managed the property for him. We know a great deal about this period in history of Mount Vernon because the abundant correspondence between the two men has survived. So this was a very, very large home. There was 5 separate farms and a main residence, all overlooking the river. There was a lot of workers that needed to be there. So when Washington was adding rooms and outbuildings to this complex, he had to hire people, but also he unfortunately used over 317 enslaved people who were kept there at Mount Vernon. When he had to leave, he left his cousin in charge of the property. And we know a lot about this time because they wrote letters often to each other about Mount Vernon. Washington gave his cousin considerable latitude in looking after the estate, and Lund was a competent manager. However, one incident aroused Washington's wrath. Lund informed him that a British warship had navigated up the river, and the crew had asked for food. Lund had not wanted to antagonize them and had complied with their request. Washington reprimanded his cousin, telling him that he should have refused to accommodate the British, even if they had burned my house and laid the plantation in ruins. So Washington was very upset that his cousin helped the British army. It says it aroused Washington's wrath, so he was extremely angry. In 1789, Washington reluctantly left Mount Vernon once again to serve as the country's first president. After 8 years, he retired from public life and returned for the last time to his beloved home. 2 years later, he died. The property remained in the Washington family until 1858. By then, the house was in a sadly dilapidated state. In that year, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, an organization of private citizens, acquired the property. The association carefully renovated the house. It now looks as it did when George Washington lived there. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association has maintained it ever since and makes it available to public view every day of the year. So Washington had to leave again when he became president and then returned until he died afterwards. So it stayed in the Washington family for a very, very long time, but it wasn't cared for properly until the Mount Vernon Ladies Association decided to take the property and now they still take care of it. So you can still go to Washington, D.C. and see Mount Vernon where Washington lived. Thank you for listening to our story today. We do have links related to each article, and if you want the link for this story, you can find it down in the description below.